The cold marble floors of the Russo estate were usually unforgiving. But at 2 a.m., hidden in the shadows, New York's most feared underboss stood entirely paralyzed. He wasn't staring down an enemy. He was watching Beatrice, his son's fat nanny, swaying to a silent rhythm, uninhibited, unapologetic, and breathtaking. The Russo estate in Long Island was less of a home and more of a fortress, surrounded by 12-foot wrought-iron gates and patrolled by men whose suits bulged with concealed firepower. It was a place where silence was mandatory, and fear was the wallpaper. For 26-year-old Beatrice Gallagher, it was simply a job. A very high-paying, intensely isolating job. Beatrice Orbea, to the very few people who bothered to speak to her, was the nanny to 5-year-old Leo Russo. She was also, by society's blunt standards, undeniably fat. It wasn't a secret, and it wasn't a fact she could hide, though she tried her hardest, by burying her soft, heavy curves beneath oversized, shapeless cardigans and dark, loose trousers. In the pristine, sharp-edged world of the Russo family, where the women who drifted through the peripheral parties were surgically enhanced, rail-thin socialites, Bea felt like a chaotic, soft intrusion. The estate staff rarely paid her any mind, dismissing her as part of the furniture. And her employer, Dominic Russo. He barely looked at her. Dominic was 34, ruthlessly handsome, and the acting head of the Russo crime family. He was a man chiseled from ice and violence, a widower who treated his home like a hotel and his staff like ghosts. Whenever he passed Bea in the expansive hallways, his dark, calculating eyes would slide right past her. She assumed he found her as unremarkable and out of place as she found herself. She couldn't have been more wrong. It was a Tuesday, a little past 2 a.m. A storm was raging outside rain, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate's massive state-of-the-art kitchen. Bea couldn't sleep. Her anxiety had been spiking a persistent hum of self-doubt that often plagued her in the dead of night. Wearing a pair of threadbare, oversized grey sweatpants and a tight black tank top she would never dare wear in daylight, she padded barefoot down the sweeping mahogany staircase. She needed warm milk. She needed a moment of absolute peace. Downstairs, the house was a tomb. The exterior guards were busy dealing with the perimeter alarms triggered by the storm. Slipping a pair of wireless earbuds into her ears, Bea connected her phone and hit play on an old, heavy bass R&B playlist. As the rich, slow tempo flooded her ears, she poured milk into a saucepan and turned on the gas stove. The blue flame flickered, casting warm light against the stark white marble. And then she began to move. At first it was just a sway of her hips. But as the music took over, Beatrice closed her eyes and let the rhythm swallow her. She wasn't the invisible, self-conscious fat nanny anymore. Alone in the dark, she was free. She traced the long island counter with her fingertips, spinning gracefully on the balls of her bare feet. Her thick thighs moved with an effortless fluidity, her heavy, soft belly rolling with the isolation of her hips. She danced with a raw, sensual power, dipping low, letting her wild, dark hair tumble over her bare shoulders. Every movement of her heavy body was deliberate, beautiful, and completely soaked in emotion. She was tracing the air with a desperate, beautiful loneliness. She had no idea she wasn't alone. Dominic Russo had just returned from a sit-down in Brooklyn that had ended in blood. His knuckles were bruised. His bespoke charcoal suit jacket was discarded over a chair in the foyer, and his mind was a chaotic storm of impending war. He had walked toward the kitchen for a glass of scotch, stepping silently on the expensive rugs. When he reached the archway, he froze. His hand tightened on the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. There, bathed in the dim blue light of the stove, was Beatrice. Dominic's breath hitched in his throat. He had never really looked at her. He had hired her because Leo had clung to her soft, warm frame during the agency interviews, burying his face in her chest like he'd finally found a safe harbor. Dominic had seen a frumpy, quiet girl. Now he saw a goddess. He watched, entirely mesmerized, as she rolled her hips to a beat he couldn't hear. The tight black tank top clung to the generous swell of her breasts and the thick, plush rolls of her waist. She wasn't rigid like the women he slept with. She was a landscape of soft, yielding curves, moving with a hypnotic liquid grace. The sheer joy and unapologetic sensuality radiating from her struck him like a physical blow. In his world of constant deception, violence and hard, sharp edges, Beatrice was entirely real. She was warm. She was alive. A dark, possessive heat flared low in Dominic's gut. It was an intense, sudden obsession that nearly knocked him off balance. He watched as she raised her arms, her head thrown back, a soft, breathless smile playing on her full lips. She spun the flesh of her thighs, catching the light, totally unashamed. Dominic didn't make a sound. He stood in the shadows for 4 entire minutes, his chest heaving silently, his dark eyes tracking every shift of her weight, every slide of her hands over her own body. When she finally slowed down to pour her milk, completely oblivious to the predator watching her from the dark, Dominic slowly backed away. He retreated to his study, poured 4 fingers of scotch, and swallowed it whole. His blood was roaring in his ears. Beatrice Gallagher, the quiet, fat nanny. He wanted her. And Dominic Rousseau always got exactly what he wanted. The shift in the estate's atmosphere the next morning was subtle but undeniable. Usually, by the time Bea coaxed little Leo down the stairs for breakfast at 7:30 a.m., Dominic was already gone, lost to the shadowy underworld of his family's import-export business. But this morning, he was sitting at the head of the massive dining table. Bea froze at the base of the stairs, her hand clutching Leo's tiny fingers. She was back in her armor, a bulky, unflattering beige cardigan and wide-leg trousers. She suddenly felt agonizingly aware of her size, the sheer space she took up in the room. "Good morning, Mr. Rousseau," she murmured, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. "Beatrice," Dominic replied. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate straight through her bones. She risked a glance upward and immediately regretted it. Dominic wasn't reading the morning paper. He wasn't on his phone. He was staring directly at her, his dark, intelligent eyes slowly dragged down the length of her heavily clothed body, as if he possessed X-ray vision that could burn straight through the beige wool to the black tank top beneath. There was a dangerous, heavy heat in his gaze that made her breath catch. "Sit. Eat with us," Dominic commanded, gesturing to the chair to his immediate right. Bea blinked, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Oh no, thank you, sir. I usually eat in the kitchen." "I didn't ask where you usually eat, Beatrice. I told you to sit." It wasn't a cruel order, but it left no room for argument. Swallowing hard, Bea guided Leo to his booster seat and cautiously lowered her heavy frame into the antique mahogany chair beside Dominic. She was hyper-aware of how her wide hips pressed against the armrests, a familiar sting of embarrassment flushing her cheeks. But when she looked at Dominic, she didn't see judgment or disgust. She saw a strange, intense hunger. Over the next few days, the psychological warfare began. Dominic stopped treating her like a ghost. He started returning home earlier. He lingered in the doorways when she read stories to Leo. He watched her. When she bent over to pick up toys, her shirt riding up to expose an inch of soft, pale skin at her waist, she would turn to find him staring, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with undisguised desire. Bea was terrified, confused, and secretly thrillingly electrified. No man had ever looked at her like that. Men usually looked at her with pity, derision, or sheer indifference. Dominic looked at her like he wanted to devour her. But the bubble of this bizarre building domestic tension was violently popped on a Friday afternoon. The Russo family was currently embroiled in a turf war with the Calabrese syndicate. Victor Calabrese, a ruthless rival, had been pushing into Dominic's territory at the Brooklyn ports. Dominic had been assured the estate was impenetrable. He was wrong. Bea was in the first-floor playroom with Leo. They were building a massive tower out of wooden blocks. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the playroom slammed open. It was Gianni Dominic's head of security, his face pale and a silenced Glock drawn in his right hand. "Breach! 3 men over the north wall. They're making a play for the kid." Gianni barked, his eyes wide. "Get him to the panic room, now!" Before Bea could even process the words, a dull thwack echoed from the hallway, and Gianni crumpled forward, a blossoming red hole in the back of his shoulder. Pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooded Bea's veins. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. The maternal instinct she harbored for the little boy who had no mother took over completely. She grabbed Leo, who began to cry, and hauled him into her arms. Despite her size, she moved with shocking speed, sprinting toward the rear of the playroom, where a reinforced steel door designed to blend into the wainscoting led to the estate's panic tunnel. "Hey, stop right there, bitch!" a heavily accented voice yelled from the doorway. Bea didn't look back. She shoved her shoulder against the heavy wood, practically throwing herself and Leo into the narrow, dark tunnel. But before the magnetic seal could close, a booted foot jammed into the gap. A man with a scarred face pushed his way in, raising a weapon. Bea didn't think. She pushed Leo behind her back, pressing him into the corner. She turned to face the hit man, spreading her arms wide, using every inch of her wide, heavy body as a physical barricade between the gun and the child. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the burn of the bullet. Bang! The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, but the pain never came. Bea opened her eyes. The hit man was on the floor, bleeding from a clean shot to the head. Standing behind him, stepping over the body like it was trash, was Dominic. His face was splattered with a fine mist of blood. His suit ruined his eyes, wide